This episode of Onward to Victory is proudly presented by our good friends at West Coast Screen Printing and Embroidery at wcscreens.com. You've heard their name for years now, and for good reason. If you have needs with screen printing, embroidery, customized promotional items for your company, organization, or more, head over to wcscreens.com and get with my friend Tony and the rest of his team. They have nationwide shipping, wholesale pricing, and exemplary customer service. Not only are they big supporters of this podcast, but like you, they are also diehard fans of the Fighting Irish. Score a touchdown with wcscreens.com. And on with the show. Irish fans, get ready for a journey into the origins of one of Notre Dame's greatest legends. Today we begin a two-part deep dive into the life of Notre Dame's first-team All-American, the legendary George Gipp. Without a shadow of a doubt, he is one of the most iconic figures in Notre Dame history. But how did he become the school's first true football superstar? In this episode, we'll explore his early years, the small-town Michigan kid with a gift for athletics, and not to mention a little bit of a rebellious streak. Just how did he get to South Bend, to the University of Notre Dame? Again, in this episode, we're going to cover his childhood and all the way to the point of his chance meeting with Notre Dame football coach Knute Rockne. So sit back as we unravel the origins of the player who would ultimately become a legend. So, buckle up those chin straps, Irish fans. This is Onward to Victory. Hello, Irish fans, and welcome to Onward to Victory, a Notre Dame football podcast. As always, I am humbled to be here, and my name is Alex Painter. Great choice coming here today for the 104th episode of this humble podcast. I guarantee you're going to find some enjoyment here. We are going to start a two-part mini-series on the life and the legacy of perhaps Notre Dame's most famous football player, and that is George Gipp. And this mini-series is actually kind of timely because George Gipp's birth month was February. He was born in February of 1895. So we are looking at 130 years since the birth of the Gipper himself. So this particular episode is we're going to start at the very beginning, and we are going to go all the way up to what Gipp biographer, Jack Kavanaugh calls the chance meeting of a lifetime, when Gipp met Coach Knute Rockne for the very first time out on the practice field at the University of Notre Dame. So really excited to take a whole episode here to kind of just dig into some of the lesser-known aspects of George Gipp. And honestly, here, even 130 years after his birth, you could make the argument that pretty much every part of George Gipp is still fairly lesser known. Gipp is one of those that has been steeped in lore and legend and maybe even a Hollywood portrayal. So really, really happy to have the opportunity to portray, or at least present a portrayal of what I believe is a very authentic version of George Gipp, but I couldn't have done it alone. So let me recognize here a few folks, an incredibly sincere acknowledgement of the show's financial sponsors. Around here we call them the Consensus All-Americans. So these folks have either contributed significantly in the past or are currently donating to the show's efforts, and they are Dr. Jeremy Scarlett of Whitefish Bay, Wisconsin, Brad Glazier of Williamsburg, Indiana, author and writer Will Fuller, who we'll mention here in a moment, of Warren, Ohio, Andy Nickel of South Bend, Indiana. From the very bottom of my heart, thank you so much. This show does not run without the generous support of these folks. So if you yourself would like to chip in and make the prestigious muster roll of the Consensus All-Americans, please pay a visit to paypal.me/ Onward to Victory, or monthly support can be given at patreon.com/Onward to Victory podcast. So again, thank you all, and I'd be remiss not to mention that this show is powered by West Coast Screen Printing and Embroidery at wcscreens.com. So please jump over to them with any screen printing or embroidery needs. This podcast is also sponsored by generous support from Augie's Locker Room in South Bend, the premier shop for Notre Dame memorabilia and gifts. No trip to campus would be complete without a stop at my good pal Augie's. One-of-a-kind items, gifts, and relics, now at a new location at 1733 North Ironwood Drive. Just a stone's throw from the old location, but the same Augie's that you know and love. All right, now for a bit of a works cited here. So I'm going to give 3 book recommendations if George Gipp is kind of your jam, or if you listen to this and you would like to learn more. So the 3 books that I always pull when researching or contemplating George Gipp, the first and foremost is called One for the Gipper, George Gipp, Knute Rockne, and Notre Dame. And that was written by Patrick Chelland. So that's Chelland, Chelland. And really, there's no two ways about it. Chelland's work has stood the test of time for a very good reason. He does a fantastic job. And unlike many accounts of George Gipp, he actually really zeroes in on his time spent in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, which we will get to here in a moment. But actually, Chelland's book, again, One for the Gipper, spends about 20% of its page length in Michigan, which is substantial. So One for the Gipper is one that you should be grabbing if you're interested in the study of Gipp. The second one is a little bit newer. It was written in 2010, or I should say released in 2010, but it's called The Gipper, George Gipp, Knute Rockne, and the Dramatic Rise of Notre Dame Football, and it was written by Jack Kavanaugh. This one really counters Chelland's, or I guess you could say complements, perhaps a little bit more appropriately. Kavanaugh doesn't spend much time on Gipp's early years. In fact, really, it's less than a chapter that Kavanaugh spends on Gipp's early years. But what he does really well is he definitely delves in and drills down on Gipp's playing career, and actually spends a pretty significant amount of time in his book talking about how Gipper's legacy persisted, particularly throughout the rest of Coach Rockne's tenure as head football coach. So that's Jack Kavanaugh, the Gipper. And thirdly, and these are in no particular order, by the way, is The Forever Year by Will Fuller, who was a one-time guest of the show and a supporter of the show, and it's a fantastic read. So The Forever Year is a novel based on the real-life romance of George Gipp and Iris Trappier. So this romance kind of carried on throughout the last year or so of Gipp's life. He was head over heels for Iris, and that relationship ended badly, or poorly, I should say, for George, and he kind of agonized over it. But anyways, everything you read about Gipp and his personality is truly encapsulated in Will's book. Again, it's work of fiction, but I would consider it historical fiction because of all of the meticulous attention to detail and all of the historical elements that are rather seamlessly baked in. So if you have a chance, it's called The Forever Year. It may not be something that you would typically read from a genre standpoint. However, I will tell you once more, it is perhaps one of the best treatments of Gipp the person I have ever read. So that's Will Fuller's The Forever Year. So I suppose that kind of serves as the bibliography, if you will, of this episode. Now, before we get into the purpose of this episode, I guess for lack of a better term there, I'd like to share some thoughts of my own about George Gipp. First and foremost, and this one may seem a bit audacious, however, George Gipp is the greatest of all Notre Dame football players, number 1. And this mantle was claimed in 1920 when George was named a Walter Camp first team All-American. Again, he was the first Notre Dame football player to be named to the first team honors. But in 1920, he would have supplanted Notre Dame's first Walter Camp All-American. That would be Louis Salmon, who was a fullback, linebacker, kicker, and punter for Notre Dame at the turn of the century. Louis Salmon was a third-team All-American in 1903 and was the greatest Notre Dame football player until George Gipp came along. So George claimed the top spot in 1920, and once more, in my opinion, he has not relinquished that in 105 years since. But why? Why do I consider him the greatest of all Notre Dame football players? That's because George Gipp wasn't just great. He was literal miles ahead of his contemporaries. No one in Notre Dame football history, again, all my opinion, was, relative to his contemporaries or his peers, more dominant. He was the best player on the field every single time. Gipp excelled in every aspect of the game. He led Notre Dame in rushing, passing, kicking, punting. His versatility was unheard of at the time. Oh, and not to mention defense. And he wasn't just a jack-of-all-trades, master-of-none type. He was elite in every aspect of the game. His 8.1 yards per carry for a single season remains the best in Notre Dame history. That was in 1920. His 6.9 yards per carry in 1919 is still ranked 9th. Which, by the way, do you need a modern-day comparison? I'll give you one here. In 2024, Jeremiah Love, in the fantastic season he had, averaged exactly 6.9 yards per carry. I mentioned Louis Salmon. He is near and dear to my heart as I have spent literal years researching him, and he is truly Notre Dame's first star. And he put little Notre Dame on the map. However, I will say that George Gipp was Notre Dame's first true superstar. Opponents had very few answers for him. He could win games pretty much by himself if needs be. And his legacy truly shaped the future of Notre Dame football. When you kind of look at how Notre Dame ran out the string here, that they parlayed that 1920 season into a decade of success. And all of this we're going to touch on, I promise you. And all of the on-field exploits we're also going to touch on. That's just the on-field stuff. Gipp was incredibly interesting as a person. And I kind of think of him as this larger-than-life personality, although, truthfully, he didn't really have much of a personality. Gipp was fiercely quiet, even laconic, just was a man of few words and was just kind of stoic. He was truly a man of contrasts, and Will Fuller, who was mentioned before, again, author of Forever Year, said that George Gipp is the closest that college football has ever had to a James Dean-like character. That's because there was maybe a little bit of fatalism in the way that George lived, maybe even played. So we'll touch on that one as well. But seriously, Will's right here. And I know that we have the benefit of hindsight and the benefit of all this information that we know about Gipp and have learned over the last century. But his early departure from Earth honestly feels a little bit inevitable. Like he was meant to shine extremely brightly for a short amount of time and then move on from this life. But enough on that for now. So let's start with Laurium, Michigan. Some of you may be aware of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, and that is exactly where Laurium, Michigan is. It is in the center of the Keweenaw Peninsula. To this day, the population rests around 2,000. When George Gipp was born in Laurium on February 18th, 1895, the population would have been maybe a little more than half of that, so right around the 1,000 mark. A little bit more provenance here for the Gipp family. George's grandfather, Antoine Gipp, was German. He was born in Prussia and emigrated to the United States in the late 1840s. And the Gipps originally landed in Albany, New York. After staying in Albany for about a decade, 1857 is when Antoine took his family and packed up what meager belongings they had and headed west. He had heard of the copper mines in Michigan, and so he kind of had his sights set on what he viewed his family's version of the American dreams, and the meal ticket here, so to speak, would have been the Wolverine State's bountiful supply of copper. However, it was about 3 years before the family left for Michigan that Antoine and his wife Agnes gave birth to a son whom they named Matthew. So 1854, Matthew is born. 1857, the family moves to Michigan. And in 1862, despite being a very advanced 42 years old, Antoine enlisted in the Union Army as a member of the 27th Michigan Infantry. Now, of course, 42 years old isn't that advanced, but when you do consider that the average Union Civil War soldier was 25 years old, 42, that's quite a ways from 25. And the 27th Michigan, after forming, quickly saw action in many, many pivotal Civil War battles. So here's one for my Civil War buffs. The regiment saw action at the Siege of Vicksburg and then actually followed commanding General Ulysses S. Grant east. And they participated in the Battle of the Wilderness, Battle of Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, the Siege of Petersburg, the Battle of the Crater, and then ultimately the Appomattox campaign, where Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia ultimately surrendered to Grant and the Army of the Potomac. So Antoine, or also he was known as Anton from time to time, would have seen a large swath of not only just the second half of the Civil War, but also some of those fights that his unit participated in were desperate. They were bloody. And to that effect, the 27th Michigan Infantry, over the course of the war, including sickness and also those who were killed in action, they lost 432 men. My guess is that could have been over half of their original strength. When Antoine mustered out in 1865, he was a corporal. He had enlisted as a private and was discharged as a corporal. So in 1865, he returns home to the state of Michigan, and he returns to that area right around Laurium, where he was working for the Calumet and Hecla Consolidated Copper Mining Company. And he and the family actually lived in a company-owned house. That was actually pretty common for these big mining companies to basically build towns around the mine, and people would move there for work. Actually, I always have to look it up. The Calumet and Hecla Consolidated Copper Mining Company, there we go, actually built 1,200 of these homes, and the Gipps occupied one of them. So when Matthew Gipp, again, Agnes and Antoine's son, once he got to his early 20s, he moved out, ostensibly to kind of strike his own path. But in 1877, he married a local girl named Isabella Taylor. And something about Matthew is he was deeply, deeply religious. He actually would ultimately become a Baptist preacher. That was his livelihood. This is according to Chellen's work, quote, "The marriage of Matthew Gipp and Isabella Taylor, as recounted by those who still have vivid impressions of the pair, was for the most part blissful. Matthew was a hard-working man and, until ill health forced his retirement, a good provider. He was a stern disciplinarian with a zealot's passion for his religious beliefs. Isabella was a gentlewoman hardly ever given to outbursts of temper. And she was in her own quiet way a deeply religious woman." End quote. So what's to note about Chellen's work is it was written in 1973. So when he was doing his interviews and conversations while he was writing his book, he was able to make contact with a number of people who would have known or lived with the Gipps or in Laurium right around this time. And so speaking of the Gipps, so again, we're talking about Matthew here, Matthew and Isabella. The latter gave birth to 8 children: Alexander, Matthew, John, Louise, Mary, Bertha, George, and Dorothy. So George was the 7th of 8 children, and he was born in a modest 2-story clapboard house on Hecla Street, undoubtedly named for the big company in town. So what's really interesting even early on about George is he kind of broke the mold almost instantly. His dad, Matthew, was actually a fairly diminutive man. He was 5'8" and only weighed 130 pounds, and no one in the family was particularly athletic. But George, even as a youngster, his athleticism became apparent, and it was in no small thanks partly due to his size. So although Matthew, his father, was, again, fairly average, the moment that young George entered Horace Mann Elementary School, he was instantly the tallest boy in his class. And in regards to his athletic ability, which again shown early and often in George's life, this is once more from Chellan, quote, "Where George's athletic talent came from is anybody's guess," end quote. Even at a fairly young age, George kind of gives you a bit of a foreshadowing what his experience is going to be like at the University of Notre Dame, just in the sense that he was really, really athletic. He was clearly bright, but his grades in pretty much all subjects were always poor. In fact, Chellan calls him a lazy, shiftless student. George seemed to despise the hours he was compelled to spend in the classroom. He had an intense aversion to homework, and as a result, almost always came to class unprepared. Teachers marveled at his keen mind, yet were driven to fits of despair by his unwillingness to apply himself. He was often reprimanded for poor penmanship, for example, and in response he took great pains to increase its illegibility, end quote. So not a great student, and also was a bit of a nonconformist. He just didn't really like being told what to do. He was kind of that classic upset the status quo type. But to get some perspective from his family about George as a kid, this is from Carl Gipp, who was a cousin. Quote, "George wasn't what you would call troublesome as a kid, but he was lazy and somewhat indifferent in his studies. He came from a strict family, but was very different from his father and his 7 siblings. George pretty much did whatever he wanted to do, but he was never what you would call troublesome," end quote. Yet another cousin, Harrison Gipp, said, quote, "There didn't seem to be anything exceptional about George. He was a quiet, modest fellow, well-liked. He didn't really seem to have any real close friends. I guess you'd call him a loner," end quote. So once more, as young George grew up, the people of Laurium might have ultimately wondered where he got his athletic ability. Again, we'll talk about that here in a second once he gets to high school. But they also were openly curious about where he got his carefree attitude. Because, of course, as mentioned, Gipp's father, Matthew, the son of hardworking German immigrants and a disciplinarian to the nth degree, that just didn't really rub off on George. And this is once more from Kavanaugh. Quote, "Gipp became the family's black sheep during his teenage years and remained so until, to the astonishment of his family friends and even those who knew him remotely, he decided to go to Notre Dame at the age of 21, end quote. But first to his high school athletics exploits. It's at nearby Calumet High School where George was a standout in multiple sports. He excelled at basketball, hockey, football, and baseball. It was in basketball he played a pivotal role in leading his team to the Upper Peninsula Championship in 1914. His athleticism translated well to hockey, where he was known as a strong and agile player, and he thrived in that region where the sport was deeply ingrained in the local culture. However, there was no doubt that Gipp's best sport was baseball. As an outfielder for the Laurium town team, he displayed the mix of speed, fielding, agility, hitting prowess. Although I have not really been able to corroborate this with primary sources, it has been written over the decades that during this time, his talent was so evident that both the Chicago White Sox and the Chicago Cubs reportedly showed interest in signing him. So, based on what we know about Gipp, he had incredible foot speed. In fact, while wearing street clothes at the University of Notre Dame, he was timed running a 100-yard dash in 10.2 seconds. So he was quick. So his ability to cover ground in the outfield and a really strong throwing arm made him a defensive asset. And he could flat hit a baseball. When Chellan was talking to some of the Laurium locals, when they were thinking about George Gipp playing baseball, one name came to mind, and that was Yankee legend Joe DiMaggio. So, yeah, George kind of garnered those natural comparisons to the Yankee Clipper. Locals also remember that every time he came up to the plate to hit, he'd always spit on his bat. So George actually never graduated from Calumet High School. And after kind of washing out of high school, he was rather aimless. He had virtually no direction, it would seem, in life. He had really no interest in working a steady job. He kind of bounced around. He drove a taxi. He would play for the Laurium semi-pro baseball team, which competed in the old trolley league. The games were few and far between, I guess. But he was kind of known by the locals as just kind of being this lazy guy. And in an area of the state and country that was pretty stalwart in its observances of religion and, going to church, George really did not go. He actually refused to go. And this was even after Matthew was appointed as deacon of the local Baptist church. But what he did find that he was really good at was billiards. And he didn't really have to work a job because he was so good at billiards and cards that he would just often stay up for days at a time and fleece all of the local and visiting miners out of their hard-earned paychecks. So all of this behavior out of Gipp, all of these personality traits, once you kind of learn how he was at Notre Dame, none of this is actually surprising. He really doesn't change a whole lot. And I'll share one final quote here out of Chelland. It's one of my favorites about Gipp. It was from yet another local here who shared the following about George, quote, "He wasn't exactly cocky, but he had no reverence for anyone or anything. He was winning a hell of a lot of money, what with poker and pool, but he was just throwing it away as fast as it came to him. He just didn't seem to give a damn about anything," end quote. And I do think it bears repeating, none of this is an admonishment on Gipp. I just think since we know how the story ends, it just makes the beginning all the more interesting. So Gipp has no intention of going to college, as was mentioned before, and that really doesn't change until about 1916. So Gipp is still parlaying his baseball talent, his obvious baseball talent, and he's playing with club teams and semi-pro teams all over the state of Michigan, and he actually plays with one in Elkhart, Indiana. And if you know your geography of Indiana, you know that Elkhart is just the neighboring county, I should say, to South Bend. But it's there that he is watched by one of his old teammates and someone who actually attended the same high school as him, named Wilbur Gray, who is better known in some circles as Dolly. But Wilbur was a standout athlete at Calumet High School himself. He ultimately went to Notre Dame, where he graduated from in 1914. But while he was there, he played baseball, he played hockey, but he was a great catcher for the Notre Dame baseball team. And this is a time when Notre Dame baseball was, without a doubt, the university's best program. They had sent dozens of players to the minor leagues, some to the major leagues, and perhaps most famously was Cap Anson, who actually played at Notre Dame in the very early years back in the 1860s. But at any rate, Notre Dame baseball was kind of one of the premier programs in the Midwest. So Gray, again, a Calumet High School product, and then a Notre Dame alum, sees Gipp play once more. And again, Gipp had established his reputation of being a power-hitting outfielder. He could drive gaps, he could put the ball over the fence, and of course we talked about his speed, and he had a very strong arm. So it was at that point that Gray gets in touch with his former coach named Jess Harper. And Jess makes a scholarship offer for George to play baseball at Notre Dame. Baseball, again, not football. It's also worth noting that Jess Harper was the football coach, the head football coach at the University of Notre Dame as well. So when Gray approaches Gipp about playing baseball at Notre Dame, Gipp reputedly said, "I'm too old to go to college, and besides, I don't have any money." And maybe the former was somewhat true. Gipp at this time would have been about 21 years old. Although, yes, he was fairly old for a first year in college. It wasn't super uncommon that a first year in college around this time wasn't your traditional 17, 18 years old. But nonetheless, 21 still would have been rather old for a new college entrant. So he really balks at the idea initially of going to college, and it took conversations with his family members who really pushed him to take advantage of the offer, which was a full tuition, room and board offer. And kind of considering the situation, it's not hard to make that reach that perhaps George's family was really looking at this opportunity to play at Notre Dame to give the young man some direction and a purpose and something to work for, and might help kind of shape him up, for lack of a better phrase. So George ultimately does decide to attend the University of Notre Dame on a baseball scholarship. And despite the obviously attractive offer of a full tuition scholarship, room and board covered, biographer Kavanaugh says it is still surprising that Gipp went to Notre Dame for 2 reasons. Quote, first, he had never expressed an interest in going to college. And second, he had not graduated from high school. Thanks to poor grades, even poorer attendance, and a number of infractions serious enough to get him suspended on several occasions, such as talking back to teachers or speaking up in class with what his classmates thought were witty remarks, but which infuriated his instructors, end quote. So, regardless of his level of preparedness for a undergraduate experience, he jumps on a train in the fall of 1916 to head down to the University of Notre Dame, again with the intention to play some baseball. I don't think there's really any evidence to suggest that Gipp had ever visited Notre Dame before he enrolled as a student, but he did tell a friend back home shortly after he arrived, quote, I was really upset when I got to Notre Dame, mainly on account of I didn't have much money. But they were pretty good about it, and after a while, everything was Jake, end quote. So it's really worth noting that George being insecure about his financial situation would have been normal. He got to Notre Dame, and again, probably hadn't seen campus before. At least there's no evidence to just suggest that he did. And he is immediately greeted by some of those sights that we know and love today. You know, immaculate church, an opulent golden dome. And this one goes out to Chelland, and it's one of my favorite go-to quotes to really pull out to describe Notre Dame at this time. George Gipp's situation would not have been uncommon. Quote, at Notre Dame, students with little or no money in their pockets were commonplace. The main reason for this was simple. Notre Dame was basically a poor boys' college, a fact that was not always apparent to the naked eye. Why wouldn't it have been apparent to the naked eye? He continues, quote, scenically, the school created an illusion of great wealth and beauty. What with its seemingly endless expanse of virgin greenery that supported, at ideally situated intervals, a number of large, sturdy brick edifices that lent themselves favorably to an atmosphere of quiet, subdued richness, end quote. So again, we have Gipp now, the undergraduate, who is kind of learning that, okay, he doesn't have much money in his pockets, but neither do many of his classmates. So let's talk about those classmates. It's worth noting that by 1916, Gipp has spent the previous 5 years playing billiards and cards in some fairly seedy establishments with men who were much, much older than him, oftentimes anyway. So photographs kind of support this notion that Gipp was rugged. He was a rugged guy and hadn't exactly lived, I should say, a clean life to this point. So he gets to Notre Dame, doesn't find academics exceedingly interesting, just as he hadn't, at Calumet High School. And he has kind of some trouble connecting with his classmates, most of whom are younger or probably don't have the same life experience he does at that time. So it's natural that he's feeling a bit of isolation. And it also doesn't help that he's at this overtly religious institution, stringent even. And, religion's not really his thing either. I mean, he was raised Baptist, and it didn't take him long to kind of fall away from the church and Catholicism and being a Catholic and a Baptist, although I'm no theologian, so someone can come check me here. I've never really interpreted that there was a ton of overlap between these two. So, not surprisingly, he kind of outgrows Notre Dame's campus fairly quickly, and he soon ends up finding billiards tables and card games in the city of South Bend proper. And it is worth noting at this time, the university had pretty strict rules against students going into South Bend, or at least, the school kind of had to know where they were going, when they were going, and why they were going into South Bend. So every time George went to the city, he was in fact breaking some of the university's rules at this time, but his trips to South Bend became more frequent and more prolonged as 1916 bled into 1917. Gipp, in a similar way he had been in Laurium, Michigan, was just kind of aimless once again, wasn't attending class with much regularity, and again, just kind of found the whole thing not very stimulating, we'll say. And there's some letters that George wrote home that, after he got over the money thing, he was pretty close to giving up. He just didn't feel like he fit in, realized he probably made a mistake going to Notre Dame. But what biographer Kavanaugh calls the chance meeting of a lifetime really changes the trajectory of Gipp, assistant coach Knute Rockne, and the University of Notre Dame's football program. So Gipp is walking around campus in his street clothes and stumbles onto the football practice field, sees a couple footballs, and just starts booting them. Assistant coach Knute Rockne is watching nearby, and this is per Kavanaugh here, quote, "For about 10 minutes, Rockne watched the pale-faced, somewhat emaciated-looking kicker send long spiral punts through the air, along with gracefully dropping footballs to the ground and in a fluid and smooth motion kicking one ball after another 50 yards and longer straight down the middle of the field. Well aware that no Notre Dame player, freshman or varsity, could come close to drop kicking a football that far, Rockne then approached the student and asked, 'What's your name?' 'Gipp, George Gipp,' he replied nonchalantly, not recognizing Rockne even though, by then, the assistant varsity football coach had become well known on Notre Dame's campus. 'I come from Laurium, Michigan.' 'What led you to come to Notre Dame?' Rockne persisted. 'Friends of mine are here,' Gipp responded, though in fact he was not aware of anyone on campus from the Calumet area. 'Played high school football?' Rockne asked. 'No,' Gipp replied, 'don't particularly care for football. Baseball's my game.' Rockne then made a command. 'Put on a football suit tomorrow and come out with the freshman scrubs,' Rockne said pointedly but with a smile. 'I think you'll make a football player.' End quote. So Gipp kind of slightly nodded and walked away. There was really no way to tell, at least from Rockne's point of view, if this young man was going to be out to practice or not. And I say young man, but Rockne's actually only about 7 years older than Gipp, and I think that was pivotal in their relationship. But anyways, so perhaps Gipp, being spurred by Rockne's assessment of him as a potential football player, it wasn't long after this encounter that Gipp did indeed turn out to football practice. And that is where part 1 will end. I look forward to sharing more about Gipp's playing career, his sensational playing career, and his, of course, compelling off-the-field storylines as well in part 2. So I'll hang it up for today. This has been Onward to Victory, a Notre Dame football podcast. And in kindness, I am your host, Alex Painter. Thanks for joining me here today. Hope to see you in part 2. And as always, go Irish.